Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Aspect Insights, your favorite podcast and live stream about Bazel and its ecosystem, although it is, of course, the only one. My name's Alex Eagle. I'm the co-founder at Aspect Build. We make a developer platform based on Bazel. And today we're going to be talking about Swift and maybe a little bit of Objective-C, but obviously languages that target the Apple ecosystem with a couple of the primary maintainers of the Bazel rules for those things. So we have Luis Padron, who works on the rule Swift, and then welcome back to the show, Brentley, who maintains a bunch of the Apple rules. Hey guys, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Since we are live streaming today, we have hopefully some folks hanging out in either LinkedIn or YouTube who can post comments. So if you're on there, please go ahead and post questions as they come up. We also got a few questions ahead of time from the community on the Bazel Slack. So we will include those in the discussion. So what to expect from this episode is essentially a state of the art of what's going on for those of you who are developing for Apple. So things that are broken, things that are coming up, sort of frequently asked questions as of mid 2025 here. So to kick it off, Luis, this is our first time meeting. I would love to. Do you want to tell me a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my name's Luis. I'm been doing contributions to the Bazel, like Apple Swift rules. That's like Rule Swift, Rules Apple, some of the stuff in Rule Swift Package Manager as well. Mostly for my day job. But yeah, I've been here for the last like 3 or so years. Brentley and Keith and them have all been super nice and welcomed me into the maintainers part of the repo. So yeah, thanks to them and thanks to you for having me on here.
Sure. Well, while we're thanking each other, thank you for all of the work on open source. It is generally rewarding in ways that are hard to explain.
For sure.
Yeah, and Brentley, welcome back. Do you want to say anything to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I've been involved in the Bazel Apple Swift kind of ecosystem for now I'm thinking about 5+ years, maybe it's 6 now. And yeah, just still chugging along in that space. A little bit more focus on actual company work versus open source this time, but I do want to start contributing back a bit more.
Cool. All right. Well, we've got a little list of topics until we get some questions from the audience. So let's start with, I guess the historical bit here was that Swift came out, I don't know what, like 6 years ago or something. Much longer.
A little bit more than that, probably.
That's when I heard about it. That's when it was like, hey, everybody should start rewriting their apps instead of Objective-C.
Was this like 11 years now?
2014. But it wasn't really usable for like
a year at least.
Okay, so 2015. Okay, this is, by the way, called Cunningham's Law, which is one of my favorite things to use, especially when trying to get people on the internet to give you their time, which is instead of asking a question, you should always just post the wrong answer and nobody can help themselves but give you the correct answer.
100%.
So at this point, I mean, there's still people with Objective-C in their legacy code bases. So there's these mixed source modules. I'm curious how that's going. And then also from Objective-C land, you would have had to like do stuff to get your third-party dependencies and write build files by hand. And I understand like that's much better in Swift. So I guess maybe Luis, is this the best? Are you the best person to answer that one as the Swift maintainer?
Let's tackle the external dependencies part of thing. So historically, like a lot of the external dependency management would come from CocoaPods, which was like it supported either Objective-C, Swift, mixed language, and there wasn't really like too many rules that were well maintained to like go from CocoaPods to like a build file, for example. There was some stuff that got there, but I guess like the de facto way to do this now is to ideally depend on stuff that is in SPM, so Swift Package Manager, and then you would use Rule Swift Package Manager and that takes like a package.swift file and it outputs like build files that you can then use in your Bazel projects. So that's highly improved. And we actually had the 1.0 release this year. So it should be pretty well suited for most people. We use it at work on the Cash App project. And as far as I can tell, it's pretty solid. There might be some minor things that are missing, but pretty active. If you guys want to post an issue in there, we can get to it.
Yeah, that's the one by Chuck Grindle, right?
Yeah, yep. Yeah, Chuck has done a great job there, and Brentley and I and a couple other people have contributed to some of the other stuff in there. And then I think, Brentley, you can probably do the Objective-C since you worked on the mixed language rule.
Yeah, so if you're using Rule Swift Package Manager, any Objective-C that's underneath, SPM will just work because currently SPM doesn't support actual mixed language modules. They have to be separate targets and depend on each other, which, by the way, if you can do that, do that. We've run into compiler bugs and everything else where it's just generally just not recommended for you to have mixed language modules. Even Apple's tooling can fall over on it, let alone some Bazel rule sets. But if you do have some mixed language modules in your own stuff, then recently we kind of rewrote an experimental macro that was in Rules Apple into Rule Swift, did a bunch of improvements on it. So now we have kind of a first class support for mixed language library, is what it's called. It doesn't, work perfectly for everyone because the main thing that it requires is that your header imports follow kind of the Bazel style instead of like the header map style where you can just do like basically like framework imports, like the system imports. So you might have to make some small changes to your actual Objective-C code, mainly headers and implementation files to get it to compile. But once you do, yeah, we've had very few issues. And we still have a, 5-10% Objective-C in our code base that heavily relies on that because any Objective-C in our code base is a mixed language module because we always do some Swift code gen mix with it. So we don't actually have any pure Objective-C libraries in our code base.
What do you recommend that folks should do? I mean, is it like eventually rewrite all of the Objective-C? Is it sustainable to leave it as the legacy code?
That's what I'd recommend, but as a minimal kind of first step to make things better, just demixing them, finding ways to have Swift depend on Objective-C or Objective-C depend on Swift, but not have the inner circular dependency that like a mixed language module would require. Demix them improves just a lot of things, and you just don't have to use that macro. We have a topic coming up about some Google upstream cherry picks, but longer term, that macro that exists, because it is just a kind of a macro around a couple of custom rules, probably be deprecated because Google does have an implementation now of Swift library that supports Objective-C sources in it, so it can kind of do its own mixed language thing that more aligns with like what XCode does. But not here yet, but maybe in the future we'd have even better support for it.
Well, I think that's a good segue to this topic of explicit modules. This is the first time I've learned about those. Like what is an explicit module versus what used to happen?
Luis, go ahead.
You got this one. I know a little bit less about the explicit module stuff if you...
Okay, that's fine. So explicit modules, one, they're enabled by default in Xcode now. So when you compile Swift code and it depends on like Clang code, Objective-C or C, before explicit modules, the Swift compiler would do this implicit compilation of that Clang code into a precompiled module, a PCM. So it does that compilation, it stores it in a module cache so that then when another Swift compilation comes along, it first checks and says, with this hash, it's a rudimentary hash, so there's misses and bugs and stuff related to that. But, with this hash, Do we already have a PCM? Cool, give it to me, and then it doesn't do the compilation again. So that's implicit modules. With explicit modules, all of the Objective-C dependencies and the compilation into PCMs are handled explicitly in the build system so that those are inputs into the compilation of Swift modules. So in Bazel land, once we eventually have it, because we don't, all those PCMs would be represented as actual build targets. They'd have proper inputs, they'd be cached, all the fun stuff. A big win for explicit modules is that it helps with debugging, because LLDB does a similar implicit compilation. It generates its own PCM files. So you can completely compile the project. Now you're debugging, and LLDB will hang for 30 seconds, minutes, because what it's doing is it's doing compilation. It's compiling these PCMs, but with explicit modules, they can reuse those same outputs.
I guess the debugger might also compile with different flags.
Yeah, but by providing, actually having the PCMs available, it'll just reuse them instead of trying to assume different things. And this ties in with some of the upstream stuff, because rules, Apple and rules Swift still get contributions from Google in their own branch, where they just kind of like capybara it over, and it's kind of a mirror of what they have internally, with some stuff excluded. And explicit modules has some of the explicit module support is in that upstream branch, but some of it's not, because it's internal to Google. So before our open source version can support explicit modules, there's some community work that needs to be done as well.
Yeah, we were talking before the show, maybe we need to find some folks at Google and get a peek at the parts that are omitted from that export. Maybe it's worth reminding everyone, Swift and Apple are kind of unique in the repositories under the Bazel build org, in that they're basically forks, but you can't really tell because it's just two different branches. But like, one branch is what Google has, and the other branch is what you get from the Bazel Central Registry, or basically anyone outside of Google is using. I imagine even at Google, I know there are some teams that use Bazel rather than Blaze. I imagine those teams are then forced onto the open source fork of the rules, or do they manage to use the Google 3 fork?
Yeah, the last I heard they do, because they use the open source version, because if they depend on TensorFlow or some other stuff that ends up dependent on our stuff, they have to use the open source one. So there's been a couple times when a Googler has come in and done some of those cherry picks for us, or like re-implemented stuff that they have in their upstream branch but would fit with the open source version, because it is a fork, we have diverged. So there's times when they've done that to make sure that a project continues to compile in both spots.
Okay. Yeah, I guess there's not really a call to action to the rest of the community, though.
I mean, a little bit. So there is this, in both these repos, there is that branch upstream, and like I said, that is what Google pushes to. And sometimes it's simple enough to just do a cherry pick and then into a PR and merge it. So like, if people see stuff in there, or they just want to try to help out, like, doing those cherry picks is a helpful thing.
Yeah. It's a problem I think about a lot. I wonder if there's an easy way to like measure the divergence between the two branches. Like, it would be pretty easy to do it in terms of like just lines of git diff, but of course what you really care about is semantically how much have they diverged, and then try to reduce it. All right, well, let's talk about, I think we covered that. So let's talk about editors a little bit. So Apple makes XCode, and then not everybody uses it. I know that like XCode is sort of the first place that new platforms come out. So like, if you're developing for the Vision Pro, do you have to use it? I guess maybe, Luis, can you explain to me a little bit about the differences and like why people pick different editors?
Yeah. So I guess like most iOS engineers are probably like just used to Xcode, because it's like the only option really if you're not using something like Bazel or some other build system. And until like, like when Vision OS came out, there was no Bazel support for it. So if you wanted to build something like that, you would probably just have to use Xcode build directly. But now as we get more and more features in Bazel, we're trying to allow support for, or like get support working for like VS Code. And by VS Code, we mean like Cursor, any of these other like editors that are based on it. And there's been some good progress in the community so far. So we have a channel in the Bazel Slack. I believe it's like source kit Bazel BSP or something like that. And it's trying to use the build server protocol along with source kit's LSP to get indexing, testing, all that sort of stuff you would get in Xcode, but in a lighter weight editor, an editor that's probably more geared towards AI and all that fun stuff. But to your question about like why would people use one over the other, I think it's like Xcode is, it's pretty heavy. It's not, in my opinion, like the best editing experience. I personally use VS Code and then like just Bazel build from the command line, and that gets me most of the way. But I definitely do miss out on like some indexing and like debugging capabilities and that sort of stuff. And that's what we're trying to like get pretty solid here. So we have like a good alternative to Xcode.
When you're doing UI layouts, I assume that's still something you do in Xcode? Like there's visual tools for this?
I don't know how many projects are still doing like, like interface, like in Xcode anymore. I think it's mostly it's all like in code, especially with Swift UI and stuff now. So I think we could get to the point where, we're doing hot reloading and stuff and it's outside of Xcode completely. Some folks from Tinder, I believe, also like posted a hot reload tool. Or not Tinder, but one of the companies that's in that BSP Slack.
Probably us, actually.
Yeah, I read it. Yeah, that's right. It was Kareem, I think.
Yeah. So one of the things is Xcode does have Swift UI previews, so a way to live edit Swift UI code and see the results, and that's actually an area that broke recently with Rules Xcode Proj. As of Xcode 16, because it was a massive architectural refactoring on Xcode side for how Swift UI previews work, and it's been a real pain trying to get that to work again with Bazel and Rules Xcode Proj. But as a workaround, there's this tool. I forget what it's called. Injection. Yeah, where you can do like hot reloading of apps so that you just have a simulator actually open and you're changing your code, and it'll cause the same kind of like Swift UI preview like behavior of edit code, see UI changes immediately. So we have that running locally.
That sounds even better because then you can see in the simulator like the real form factor of the device, or like it's probably got better fidelity with what a user will see in the layout.
Yep. And as more kind of an answer to why someone would choose something other than Xcode, like when your projects get to a certain scale, like our companies, like Xcode just starts to topple over. So the number of targets you have, the number of schemes, the VS Code launch configurations equivalent in Xcode, just the number of source files even, like Xcode takes 30 seconds minimum for it to be responsive for us, if not more. And that's not even counting like the minute plus that the build server has to like run through to check dependencies and do analysis, which is all wasted because Bazel's going to do that anyway for us. And if we close the project, it currently takes over a minute just for Xcode to close the project because it's doing weird things, trying to save stuff in the background. And Xcode is heavy. So a lot of the work in Rules Xcode Proj is just around generating this massive XML file to describe the project. Where the VS Code, it's like, I have it on disk. I know most of what you want right here. Like it's just they're just files, right? So a VS Code or a non-Xcode experience is way lighter, more performant, and if we solve indexing and debugging and stuff like that, especially with AI tooling like in Cursor and stuff, it ends up being just a much more favorable experience.
And another point on that is like, whenever Apple does release updates to Xcode, this kind of tends to break not just Bazel's like Rules Xcode Proj, but like every other like project generator sort of thing. And so relying less on Xcode and more on like the build system and like, open source editors, I think is likely the future. I think Xcode is going to be still like the thing that people default to if you're, building a little project or something, or if you just use Xcode build, but it's definitely not a great experience for us to maintain, nor for people to use it at scale. So we're just trying to figure out like a way to like, tackle that problem, give people alternatives. And I do think it's going to be still work, even if we get the experience perfect, like people are used to Xcode. And that's something like us and who work in this field of like, developer experience, we have to kind of sell our users who are like the engineers building the product.
I'm dying to know what Apple uses for things like GarageBand or Keynote or something. I know they have like some pretty complicated iOS apps. Do you think they use Xcode for those?
Xcode, yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Okay. I guess they give everybody a Mac Pro with an M2 Ultra chip, and that helps.
I mean, there's Xcode Cloud, right? So
I did not know that. Does that help?
I mean, I doubt they use that. It's mainly for CI, but there's been work. It looks like there's work in like the Swift compiler and stuff too. They wanted to conform to RE API, so there's like a bunch of remote caching work and maybe remote execution work. So I mean, if we're talking in a couple of years, maybe we're talking about how Xcode by default integrates well with the Bazel exist-in backends for caching or remote execution. And if that happens, besides for the UI sluggishness, like there's maybe a lot of people don't actually even consider Bazel. It's unless they really want a lot of the other benefits, like multi-language, multi-repo, easy support. So,
well, we'll have to talk to somebody from Apple and see if it's possible. Obviously, it wouldn't be enough for Xcode to just speak the RE2 protocol, but you would want it to create the same digest keys that Bazel does for a given compilation. So then it would need to actually share probably the Starlark code that you've written to know what the compilation unit should look like. Although maybe it's useful for it to even if it doesn't have the same keys, it could just like borrow a cache, but essentially be a different partition in there.
Yeah, it'd just be a different partition. I mean, right now, even with rules Xcode proj, because of the way it's kind of set up, we do have a partition split right now. So for people that want cache hits for Xcode on CI, they actually just have to run a special command line invocation to get those caches. Your normal test runs and things aren't hits either. So it'd be kind of similar, like where you'd run like Xcode build on CI to warm your cache, and then your developers would be able to get your cache hits.
Well, since you mentioned remote cache, is there anything else we wanted to talk about with editors before we go over to remote cache and remote execution?
I guess I just wanted to mention that, like, we did the link for Spotify's BSP server, which in combination with the Swift extension does get you background indexing. So you should be able to get like full indexing of your code, jump to definition, stuff like that. But the main, and with some changes I made in Rules Apple, you can actually set up your own custom launch configurations to get debugging of apps. We have a little bit of work to do to get test debugging working. But then the final missing piece is like test explorer integration, or the code coverage integration, and like automatic launch configurations, because you just kind of have to know what you want to launch currently. Those last pieces probably need their own extension instead of an update to the Swift extension, because it probably needs to interface with a more fleshed out BSP server to be able to expose that information the way it needs. So like, even if you use everything that's available today, you're probably going to miss out on like the testing integration. That's areas that need some improvement.
One random note, just because I get to chat with folks in different ecosystems on the show. We had Justin Kaiser from JetBrains, who said that they are no longer using the build server protocol for like the new version of the plugin for like the Java community, which I find a little ironic, because my sense was that like they were driving this effort to have a standardization of how do editors ask the build system to like, dry run a compile or tell me the options you're going to use so that I can properly index the code. So it's interesting that the build server protocol is still getting used over here.
Yeah, I have high hopes for the build server protocol. So, watch this space.
Okay, cool. All right, so you mentioned getting remote cache hits. Um, the obvious other thing everybody wants from Bazel is that it has this remote execution protocol, which should magically make my builds faster. Would be nice, but it actually can make builds faster. So like the question we got from the community was like, what are some tips or how to consider like a general walkthrough of what an RBE remote build execution implementation would look like?
Yeah. So first, you have to have a provider that has RBE working well for macOS execution. I don't know what the landscape looks like out there. I'm not going to really plug any individual providers, but there are some out there that work really well with iOS compilation. But once you have that, there's going from a macOS CI machine or local machine and executing on a macOS executor, which you basically have to do. You can't really like compile iOS code on Linux, like their license and reasons you need to run Xcode, all this stuff. So your executor needs to be macOS. That's working really well. I just noticed one small bug where if you have Swift dependent on like CC library, there's a small bug, but I'll get that fixed really soon. But other than that, it just works. It's more about optimizing cost, your cache usage, bandwidth usage, stuff like that. And in that space, like there's some tips, like you want to be using tree artifacts in Rules Apple. If you don't use tree artifacts, then your like frameworks or your library bundles are going to be like zipped up into like an IPA or .zip, and that's one blob. So anytime it changes, you generate a new blob.
Is that something that users need to do if they write custom rules, or even if they're just using the standard rules, they need to turn on this use tree artifacts?
Standard rules, there's just a build setting in Rules Apple that you'd want to turn on.
Okay, so there's something that has a default of false, but you think everybody should really turn it on?
Yeah, and that default probably needs to change soon. There's some historical reason why you don't, because like you do want to generate IPAs at times, but I think longer term, we just need an IPA rule instead. So then iOS application will always just generate a .app, and then there won't be any distinction. And the first will always use tree artifacts, but we're just not quite there. So that's the historical reason. But if you turn this on, then you're going to get a .app out of it, not an IPA.
Right, which means that the remote cache and remote execution will see a bunch of, we'll be able to reason about all the files inside of the tree artifact.
Yeah, you'll get a directory entry down, and that will list all the individual blobs, and all those can be cache hits. And then if you change one individual thing in there, like the binary itself or one of the resources, you're only going to upload and or download that blob difference. The rest are cache hits.
Okay, cool.
That's one big one. We mentioned explicit modules aren't a thing yet. And because of that Swift module cache, you want that to stick around on your executors. So there's some providers that allow you to like preserve the workspace or recycle the runners, keep some like undeclared outputs around. You want your Swift module cache, which is an undeclared output, to stick around so that when another Swift compile lands on that executor, it doesn't have to recompile those PCMs. That's a huge thing. That's like a 3 to 5x performance difference for Swift compiles.
Okay, so that's a matter of how you configure the remote execution provider if you're running it yourself, and if you're using a hosted service, then ask the service provider to make sure they're doing that.
Yep.
Okay. One other question on that topic, since we got a live comment, would it make sense to leave this option off for tree artifacts locally to save disk space? And only
you should turn it on for. There's actually an issue in the Rules Apple thing repo. If you turn off rules or tree artifacts, it actually generates some intermediate files, and they can be pretty heavy as well. So usually you should just run with this on. We're working to flip the default to true so that this isn't even a problem for people. And then like if you do want an IPA, then you just flip it to false. But for historical reasons, like there's no support for like symlinks, I think is the main problem here for tree artifacts, and that's been solved. So I think we just need to like get that updated. And there's some stuff that landed recently in upstream to add support.
And if you use like disk cache, which you probably should if you're doing local development, like the same things apply. Like in the disk cache, it's going to be only caching the things that kind of have changed. So
right, because the disk cache actually goes through the code paths in Bazel that speak the remote execution protocol, right? So it's really like a remote cache on disk.
Yep. Basically, you want to have it always enabled unless you actually literally are generating an IPA, which should only be for like a release device build. And in that specific one, you want to turn it off so that the rules go through the IPA path instead of the .app path. Like that's the only time you want to disable this build.
Yes, and I think it's universally true under Bazel that you should have like a config equals release where you're doing opt compiles and stamping and other things like that. So hopefully everybody already has that.
That or use like with config and set it up a transition for your target to do the same thing.
Yep.
Two more kind of tips for RBE. You could run your tests on your CI machine. Like I said, I'm talking about CI mainly for RBE because that's the general main use case that you're going to be looking at to use RBE. You can run the tests on your host machine, which works pretty well, especially if those are ephemeral, because then you don't have to really worry about the simulators that get spun up or managing them or any of that stuff. You maybe want to pre-spin some up to deal with like boot times with simulators, but if you're going to run the simulator tests on RB, which can be very useful, especially if you want to fan out hundreds, thousands of tests, you're going to need a simulator manager of some sort. There's a draft PR I put up there to kind of just show like what we're doing internally. There's some tweaks to it I want to do before I propose open sourcing it and accepting it into Rules Apple. But you're going to need that because otherwise you're going to have a bunch of either stale simulators or horrible performance on the executors. Like you just kind of can't have a bunch of simulators open taking up 6 gigs each on your executors. Things start to fall over.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's almost like with your PR, do you have more of an affinity? So you have like an executor has exactly one simulator that it manages?
Sort of, yeah. So we do set up with platform properties with our provider to do that. We do custom resources to then define it out so that they only do get scheduled like one of our UI tests or multiple of our logic tests. And then the simulator manager handles spinning up and down and reusing simulators after it's already gone through like the scheduler phase. So it depends on the fact that the scheduler is doing the right thing. If it's not doing the right thing, or you're doing it locally, because we use the simulator manager locally as well, it'll still spin up multiple simulators and like take away a bunch of your RAM. But within that, it handles like reuse and like there's like leases it does. So a UI test will have an exclusive lease on a simulator where a logic test won't, because you can run multiple logic tests on the same simulator.
Got it. Yeah. So I'm curious, is the state of the art that simulators are high fidelity enough that folks no longer have like a physical device farm, like a rack of iPads that they're running tests on, or is that still a thing too?
Simulators are your first line like of testing. We still have device testing, but we don't do it as part of CI in this way. We do them on post-merge or part of our release process, and then we send them over to a device farm provider to then run the tests on devices.
Yeah, and on the simulator manager front, even without RB, it's an issue where because we do have like, I think it's kind of unique to like the whole simulator part of this. It's that when you Bazel test, usually like it just runs on your machine, right? If you're running like a Swift test, there's no problem. But when you're doing it on a simulator, if it's like a UI test, for example, and it needs to take control of that simulator and like use the app host, if you try to run 2 UI tests, even locally, that's a crash because it's going to try to boot on the same simulator. So even for local development or even local testing, some sort of like simulator manager. At work, we use a very simple lock file mechanism, but a better approach is like some server that manages it or something like that. So yeah, we're going to be looking at merging that at some point.
Are people using the exclusive tag on these tests today in Bazel to force it to have only one running at a time?
Or local test jobs one, stuff like that. They're doing a bunch of various ways to ensure that you never have like 2 UI tests run on the same simulator.
Yeah, cool. Obviously, tags equals exclusive is going to not work well when you try to go to RBE because Bazel will still only schedule one of those at a time, even though remote executors are available to do other ones and they do have proper isolation, right?
And there's also a bug with exclusive if local. Like that's still just exclusive. So that's fun.
Oh,
Yeah, I have one more tip.
exclusive if local sounds like just what we would want for this. That's too bad it doesn't work.
It doesn't work. It still messes with schedule and on remote. The final tip is that when you're doing release builds with RBE, there's code signing involved. There's going to be provision profiles and your like private keys that have to go into a keychain. And ideally, you don't want to manage your executor's keychain, and you don't want your rules to manage them either because there's race conditions around adding and removing stuff from the keychains and everything else like that. So ideally, you don't send any provision profiles or certs and keys to RBE. Don't even get them cached. So to do that, Rules Apple has this code sign-in dossier tool. And you can set some flags in such a way that your build will produce your IPA unsigned, and then it'll also produce this zip file that has, so I guess the provision profiles will be there, but it has the provision profiles, but that's it. And then you use another run tool after the build to be able to sign that. So then you sign that on your CI machine, separate from RB.
Cool. All right, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, there's similar stuff going on in other languages for supply chain security. Obviously, Apple has been way out front of this for a long time. One other question here for RBE: do you still set local test jobs to 1?
No, I mean, with RBE, that flag doesn't do anything for us because for us we do run the tests on RB. We don't run them locally on the CI machine. Some people have it set up where they don't want to deal with all the simulator manager stuff and all that stuff, so they do all building on RB, but they still run the tests on CI, and then you just need to treat all your tests the same as you do on the fact that you're not using RB. The fact that you built the stuff on RB doesn't really matter for how you run the test. So if you are using the local test jobs, exclusive flag, any of that type of stuff, you'd still have to do it in that case. But if you're using RB to run the test, that flag doesn't do anything.
Right. It says local as the name of the flag for a reason. All right. Well, that covers RBE, I guess. Maybe one final question I should throw in just for anybody who is still at the beginning of that journey. What's the, like, is it worth it? Like, it sounds like RBE is some effort to set up.
It can be worth it, especially for CI. I don't think at this exact point it's worth it for local development because of latency overhead and like just the cost of RB. But for CI, it can be worth it because you can be much more efficient for the use of these Mac OS machines, and the Mac OS machines are expensive, so you want to be as efficient as possible with them.
Do you have a sense of what the cost savings can look like?
So with our current setup, which I'll talk about in a little bit, like it's kind of hard to do that. But for a normal setup where you have like a CI machine, Mac OS CI machine, and then you have Mac OS executors, 2 times I've estimated it out to be that you can use basically 1/3 of your CI machines that you were using before just for CI, and then the remaining 2/3 can be RBE, and that should be about you'll get more out of your machines than you were before. Like that's about the ratio that your resources end up having to be. For us, we use Linux actually for initiating our builds, so we actually have pretty massive savings there because our CI machines can just be 4-core, containerized images. So
yeah, and if none of your actions have to spawn locally, or if they're cross-platform actions, then it means you're not spending on a Mac machine that's just running the Bazel JVM server orchestrating the remote work.
Yeah, and that's why we went the route, and then we're able to kind of share the same infrastructure with our Android side, and to just run on Linux for our CI, so we didn't have to have a bunch of custom differences between the two. So in that space, like, yeah, we were able to get much better efficiency, but then also we were able to have full Linux CI, which was a big bonus for us.
Yeah, that sounds great. I wonder if people who are not you would be able to get that to work.
Well, speaking of that, soon, months, I'll have a blog post where I deep dive into that. So.
Oh, neat. Okay, well, I'll go give that a try. Anything we want to talk about Rules XCode Proj, which was one of your massive efforts from, I think, like, what, 4 years ago, and still the way of generating XCode projects?
Yeah. Luis, you want to take some of it?
Yeah, we just got like a couple of questions, and like we've had this asked before as well, sort of like best practices, tips, tricks on Rules XCode Proj, mostly around like how do people like integrate this into their projects. And for like some context, you basically like Rules XCode Proj, you define an XCode Proj target, and then inside of there you provide like the schemes, like the kind of stuff you want the project to look like, and like what kind of targets are included in there. Obviously, if you're working on a larger scale, like there's going to be a lot of new targets constantly, and so maintaining this list of things is not ideal. You either have to have like something generated with like some lint checks, etc. So what a lot of people do, like I think Brentley and I as well at our job, what we do is we have like a CLI tool that kind of generates these targets on the fly, and at Cache, it's kind of like the interface is basically Cache project edit, and then you give it a list of targets. And these could be either Bazel labels or just like the names of a target, and then we do like some fancy querying to figure it out. But yeah, we simply like take those targets, and then we do like either like we look up, I think like one dependency away, and then like the reverse dependencies of everything, to get all the targets that you might want to edit on into a generated target that then we run the project generator on. And so like someone could be like Cache project edit feature, where feature is like the thing you're working on, and you don't need like the whole project in Xcode.
Neat.
It's
okay, this is like what I've called like focus mode, or there's a term for this from like the Java community to make one of these.
Yeah, and like Rules XCode Proj has its own focus thing as well. But again, the issue is really like you have to maintain this list of things. So putting it as like a dynamic generation is a lot nicer. And maybe we should talk about like supporting something like this, even if it's like a simpler CLI tool that ships with Rules XCode Proj. That might be like a nice thing for people, because we kind of do all have like the bigger companies do have like some sort of implementation like this, and it's not that complicated. So yeah, maybe that's something that we could make an issue for and like try to upstream. But essentially, yeah, we just generate it on the fly, so you don't have to like maintain the build files. The other part is getting your developers to like generate smaller projects. That's another issue. Some people do like to work on this giant massive project because they don't like the like context switching of like going from smaller project to the other smaller project, even if it's a much better experience. But yeah, I don't know how to solve that one. I think you just make the smaller project a better experience.
Or VS Code.
Yeah, exactly.
That's why
It's
like
not even an issue.
The developers that want to just be able to have the whole workspace available, like that's kind of the solution in the end. Yeah.
Is there a benefit to having both open, like you're using Cursor or Windsurf or something in VS Code for like a lightweight editing experience in a focus mode on like just a few components that you're working on, but you also keep Xcode running because you have enough RAM to leave it in the background and like you don't wait for it, but when it's up you can use it to like explore the larger project and like navigate through to other pieces of a giant app?
Yes and no. So yes, there's the benefit, but at the same time, Xcode sitting there churning through background indexing uses up all my CPU and my battery. And if VS Code's also now doing that, like my machine basically comes to a halt. So.
Yeah. I mean, people do like leave it background indexing. I think that's fine. But but yeah, once we get like the same sort of behavior in like a VS Code editor, then like you have like these two competing things. So I don't think it makes as much sense there. But really, like it's use a smaller project, and like we should probably work on some CLI tool that solves this problem for people in open source. But
Yeah. Well, there's not enough time for all of the open source contributions you might like to make, nor does anyone's employer want to pay you to spend all of your time doing that. So this might be a plug for the community. So I'm sure you can give someone a rough sketch, or like, here's some broken code from our CLI, like, take this forward and be the champion of it. So I know there's a couple of places that folks can come and find you to get more involved in the project, right? So there's the hashtag Apple channel on the Bazel Slack, and you've also got a Google group, which is Bazel Apple Swift Ecosystem, which I will put up on the screen here. Also, we'll make sure to share a bunch of these links in the show notes. So look down in the description and find that. Luis and Brentley did a great job filling in a bunch of links ahead of time that you can find here.
Yeah, the Google group, we try to meet somewhat regularly. I think it depends on like how busy we all are, and if I'm able to run it or not. But yeah, join the group. I think we'll be trying to do these more often. It's been like every few months, or as topics boil up. And then yeah, the channel, the Slack channel, I think is the go-to spot. Just go there if you ever have any questions, and then we can redirect you to other places.
Cool. Well, maybe as a way to wrap it up, and also to motivate people to come and participate, Apple rules, iOS plus Bazel seems like a pretty great combination. Like, we're speculating like, how on earth does somebody at Apple develop GarageBand without this great stuff? It seems like it is taking off. Like, do you have a sense of like how successful this is, and if somebody does come and participate, how much impact they're going to have on the world?
I mean, it's definitely impactful. Like our builds went from like over an hour to under 20 minutes, like just build time, and we're not even using RB or anything like that. So it's like the proof is in like the pudding, as people say, I guess. It's definitely useful for scale. I think we're still not at the point where it's like any small little project might want to use this. I think there's still too much setup and stuff involved. But again, like if you want to contribute, make that better, please do. Yeah, docs, examples, like anything, cherry picks. And again, just come to the Apple channel if you're interested and have like an hour or two to spend on something, and we could probably point you in like a direction.
Do you have a sense of what, like, let's say I'm working on an app and I'm not sure if it's the kind of scale that should switch to Bazel or not? Like, what would be an obviously too small, or an obviously definitely big enough?
Yeah, if you're starting to think about using like a project generator, like Twist or something like that, which is another alternative that still uses Xcode build, for example, I think you're probably at the scale where it's like it's getting a little bit too tough to manage. And so maybe that's when you want to look into either Bazel or like, the project generators that are out there, like they kind of help you encode like the project in some way that's easy to edit, where you can get the same behavior in Bazel, but also like build performance and remote cache and stuff. So I think when you're at that scale, it's probably like when you start questioning which tool to use.
All right, awesome. Thank you. That's great. Brentley, is there anything you wanted to add to wrap it up?
If anyone's looking to, test out a migration or stuff like that, a couple years back, I did write, a year and a half now, how to migrate an iOS app to Bazel on my blog. I think Alex can put the link up here. A little out of date. Rules Swift Package Manager is 1.0 now, for example, and the mixed language library is in Rules Swift instead of Rules Apple. But for the most, and the cache forming part for Rules Xcode Proj, there's a concrete example in the repo now instead of what was talked about in the blog post. But the rest of it still holds true, and I know a couple of companies have done their exploration based off of that guide, and are now actively building with Bazel as well.
All right, that's awesome. Well, we'll see you guys back here again when Apple releases the next platform device. I wonder what it'll be. I guess it's not going to be a car. We're not going to be making Apple car firmware infotainment system for the screen or anything, but it's such a it's so wonderful, like that their consumer electronics are kind of ubiquitous in our lives. It's nice to be able to do engineering work for those. So yeah, thank you both for coming on, and so hopefully see you guys. I know we'll meet the community in Atlanta. Sadly, Brentley can't make it this year from a conflict. Everyone else who's there, let's get together and do the hallway track.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.